Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The year is 19 BBY, Coruscant is burning, the Jedi threat has been neutralized, and a new order is quickly taking control of the military and government structure of the Republic. The Separatist High Council on Mustafar is betrayed and executed by Vader, leading to a cessation of hostilities in all major theaters of war in the galaxy. Only small pockets of isolated Separatist holdouts are still active and being quickly surrounded and destroyed by the Clone Army, who themselves are about to be decommissioned. We know now in hindsight that the Clone Wars was a carefully orchestrated conflict created by the Sith and controlled opposition in order to create so much chaos that Palpatine could just take over. But I feel like oftentimes we give the Sith a little bit too much credit for starting the Separatist crisis. I mean, to create a successful secessionist movement, you actually need real grievances out there to sustain the movement, right? You can pay people all the money you want to participate in protests and troll people on the holonet, but ultimately you're going to need true believers. You're going to need people who are willing to die for a movement. And if you take a look at the huge disparity in both political and economic power between the Outer Rim and the core regions of the galaxy, well, that's an issue that already exists right there and is the perfect foundational issue to start a political movement around. Dooku wasn't inventing grievances, he was simply acknowledging them and giving a certain group of people who already were suffering a voice. And these people, the wretched and impoverished, forgotten souls of the Outer Rim, never really had someone watching out for their interests, especially someone as interesting and regal as Dooku. And it's no surprise he quickly became a superstar. It's like if in our world, some famous TV celebrity you grew up watching suddenly ran for president. And not only is he not like other politicians, speaking an elite political speech about policies and things you don't understand, he's talking your language. He's talking about how he's going to make your life better. And more importantly, he gets you, he understands you, and he's going to be fighting for you against, some kind of evil, whether it's real or imagined evil, doesn't really matter, but this is your guy. And this was the power of Dooku. And so while Count Dooku might not have been a true believer in the cause that he was leading, the individuals in that cause were true believers, and there was a real political issue there for them to support. And because the emotions, the feelings, the politics are real, it makes this simulation of a conflict even more realistic, and that is very useful to the Sith. We live in a world today where data is incredibly important. So if we take a look at this Clone Wars, just imagine it as one of the largest military exercises that's ever been carried out. And there are tons of things that people can learn from what happens. In a video we did a while back, we talked about how the Sith sponsored certain business entities leading up to the Clone Wars and helped them take over their entire industries to the point where they've established the monopoly. Then the Sith would have these mega conglomerates fully invest in the Separatist cause, bringing all of their resources and assets along with them, so that when the Republic won the war, those companies suddenly were seen as hostile entities that could be taken over and nationalized by Palpatine. This gave Palpatine a huge advantage when he started building his new military-industrial complex. And that's because decades of Sith and corporate maneuvering had already essentially concentrated all of those assets, all of those factories and resources under a handful of companies for him. So we already understand that the Clone Wars was started to give Palpatine the political power and tools to actually take over the entire government. At the same time, we've also learned that the Clone Wars was an attempt by the Sith to re-jump and restart the military-industrial complex that had basically laid dormant ever since the Ruusan Reformation 1,000 years ago. Now I'm starting to realize that there's a third part to all of this craziness. See, the Clone Wars was, in many ways, the first purge by the Sith of individuals they saw as persona non grata. The old Churchill line, never waste a crisis. Well, that's exactly what the Sith did. They made the most out of the crisis, the Separatist crisis. Think about what kind of individuals join a Separatist movement. Yes, you have a handful of wealthy industrial tycoons who are looking to profit from the conflict directly, but these are really secretive individuals. I mean, most of the Confederacy didn't even know about them, and, they didn't represent the large, masses of people who joined the Separatist movement. By and large, the Separatist movement is made up of a diverse group of citizens who all have real grievances against the central government. Many viewed the Republic to be a corrupt entity where the executive and legislative branches are so weighed down by bureaucracy and corruption that they're no longer able to do their jobs properly. These are individuals who are vehemently against large federal government, the whole core power dynamics that have ruled the Republic for 1,000 years. They support individual rights, planetary rights. They want a legislature that represents the people. This all sounds really great, right? These are individuals who decided to rebel against the Republic because they believed that they got very little in return for all the taxes they paid the central government. I typically dislike political labels like liberal and conservative because I feel like, an individual, if they do partake in politics, they're far more complicated than that. I mean, they have personal experiences, ideological beliefs, a lot of different things that, makes up what their political identity is. And just one word it's not enough to describe them. But it's not far-fetched to say that most separatists were vehemently against the idea of dictatorships or imperialism. I mean, heck, that's what these guys thought they were fighting against during the Clone Wars. They thought the Republic was already a dictatorship. So how do you think these people are going to act when a totalitarian military first dictatorship emerges with the Galactic Empire? And it's really no surprise that many of the first rebels that fought against the Empire were former Separatists. Individuals like Cassian Andor, for instance, who, not because of a political will, but because of circumstances, ended up fighting against the clones and then decades later, the Empire. And so I believe the entire Clone Wars was just a simulation. It was a test that allowed Palpatine to see what would actually happen if a large insurgency tried to take out the central government. An insurgency that was heavily sponsored by rogue corporate powers and the plentiful resources that can be found in the Outer Rim. Remember guys, Palpatine wasn't just trying to remove rights from individual citizens, he was also trying to remove rights from individual companies that didn't want to work with him, right? Everyone had to bend knee towards him. And so the first goal of the Clone Wars is really just the aftermath of the Clone Wars. You have entire swaths of the galaxy completely devastated, needing aid and manpower to basically rebuild. Otherwise, these places are going to be neglected and they're just going to wither away and die. And this is perfect for the Empire because most of their important resource extraction sites for materials like Dunium, Durasteel, and Transparasteel lay in Outer Rim worlds like Iradu and Lothal. While worlds like Iradu were already well positioned to support the Empire, Lothal needed infrastructure improvements, and more importantly, there was a large Separatist movement on the planet that first needed to be wiped out. In the aftermath of the Clone Wars, Lothal was desperately in need of funds for rebuilding, which is where the Empire graciously inserted itself and built a garrison and started building industrial infrastructure for what eventually would be known as Senior Fleet Systems to take over. Of course, there was this whole issue with farmers, having land on valuable fields where Dunium could be strip mined from the surface of the planet. And so the Clone Wars was basically like this massive fire that burned and cleansed through most of the Outer Rim. It killed or severely damaged any local movements who were fighting for independence or sovereignty. At the same time, the devastation wrought by the war gave voice to political leaders who wanted federal government intervention. Remember, no one knew how evil the Empire was when they first started rebuilding everything. Like no one knew that they were going to build like a giant super laser and start imprisoning people and stuff like that. And so providing aid and loans really opened the door for the Empire to peacefully gain a foothold on non-aligned worlds. And also, this is really important, after 4 years of continuous fighting, I mean, just imagine how these people felt. I mean, they were ready to accept any help they could find, whether it's from the Empire or from whoever, right? What the people of the galaxy didn't want was more conflict. They didn't want any more war or fighting. And so this really gave the Empire a sort of grace period where there are very few insurgencies or attempts to take down the central government in the Empire's first few years. I mean, even Cham Samdullah was hesitant to immediately rebel against the Empire after losing so much during the Clone Wars against the Separatists. The sad truth is most people do not care about their individual rights or what kind of government is running them if there are bombs, landing outside their door. It's a hierarchy of needs thing. Personal safety comes before political systems. It always has for the majority of people. And this is why populists love creating a sense of fear in their constituents, because fear is a powerful emotion. I mean, that's what Star Wars is essentially about. Fear leads to bad things. Emotions, a lack of control over your emotions leads to bad things. And this is what populists and, malicious political actors like Palpatine tried to use to get control. Now, when Palpatine used control opposition in Dooku to orchestrate this conflict, he was closely watching the behavior of the Confederacy, because he understood that once he took over the Republic, there would be no more external threats that could challenge him. Palpatine understood that all future threats that he would face would most likely come internally, and now that the whole Yuzhang Vong invasion thing is no longer canon, trust me, I'm more upset about this than most people. I read the entire New Jedi Order series when it came out. That means when Palpatine builds his Imperial Military, it's most likely designed to actually face another internal threat. And at the time, the best simulation they had of what that threat would look like would be the Separatist droid army. The Sith strategy to start the conflict was truly brilliant. By making things as natural as possible, it made it much easier to sustain the movement. The various mega conglomerates coming together and fielding a massive droid army that was cheaply manufactured was a separate solution to being outnumbered and outgunned by the much larger and richer Republic. Automation and cheap resource costs, that's the only thing the Separatists really had going, and this is why they were even able to challenge the Republic in the first place. We also have to remember that Palpatine and the Sith in general were very cynical. They assessed that since the galaxy had been at peace for so long, neither the Republic or the new Separatist movement could actually stomach the true cost of war. Therefore, they used proxies for both sides of the conflict. You have clones fighting droids. Their belief is that the average individual is just not willing to die for their political beliefs, and that if Republic and Separatist citizens were actually fighting on the front lines, this war would have ended extremely quickly because of war fatigue. The Sith were also quite cynical about the entire Outer Rim versus core dynamic. Even though they exploited this tension, the Sith had very little respect for the abilities and desires of the individuals who made up the Separatist heartland. They saw these individuals as useful idiots that they could essentially throw at the Republic. And then once the war finished, they viewed them as cheap and easy to exploit labor. The Sith saw these individuals as cowards, too weak to essentially fight for themselves. And so the Sith's fear, Palpatine's fear, was only some adversary, a smart, shadowy figure or organization not all that different from the Sith, who was able to start a conflict by using the very same strategies that the Sith did. And based on the experiences of the Clone Wars, especially those early months when the Separatist droid army was accidentally discovered by Kenobi, Palpatine got to feel what the full might of a droid army could actually do. These were cheap, mass-manufactured soldiers that could easily overwhelm even the best equipped and trained and led military force in the galaxy, the Grand Army of the Republic. This probably was eye-opening for Palpatine. As well-planned as the Clone Wars was, there were some major hiccups in those early moments. For instance, anyone with access to a larger campaign map who was tracking troop movements probably would have assessed that the Separatist military's numbers were so great that they could have easily surrounded and destroyed the Grand Army of the Republic in a relatively short period of time and then just proceeded to take over the rest of the galaxy unhindered. This is probably why during the early Imperial period, Palpatine actually encouraged the anti-droid sentiment that was just everywhere. He went as far as to approve legislation banning the construction of new battle droids, although he would later regret that somewhat when the KX series droid was rolled out. Empire ended up just making the KX series legal by reclassifying it as a security droid. But by banning the construction of most battle droids, the Sith were able to destroy the infrastructure necessary to create large droid armies. Palpatine personally also didn't like this idea of fielding a droid army, not only because of public opinion, but because he didn't want someone to be able to either shut down his entire army in one shot or worse, hack it and take it over. Plus, the organic clone troopers he had used during the Clone Wars performed so well, Palpatine was convinced that he could program humans to be as loyal as droids. Now, if we continue with this theory that Palpatine was just running the Clone Wars like a simulation to see how the galaxy could respond to an insurgency, then that's easy to explain why the Imperial military develops in the way it does. In hindsight, all of those large Imperial-class Star Destroyers, Death Stars, seem kind of silly when compared to the tiny maneuverable fleet that the Rebellion use. It seems like a gross mismatch, but in defense of the Empire, they had no idea what future threats they were going to face. And the Rebellion had all of the time in the world to research what the most effective strategy would be to counter the Imperial fleet. So when you take a look at the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, it's actually an attempt by the Empire once again to fight the last war, to fight the threats that they believe will once again rear its ugly head. Take the ISD, for instance. This is a massive orbital artillery barge. It has more turbolasers than an entire old Republic sector fleet, and it can change the course of any ground battle in just a few minutes with a few volleys of fire from orbit. Heck, forget about changing the momentum of a ground battle. You could change the face of a planet, change the face of a mountain, glass over entire regions of a continent. This was an extremely useful tool for a military that is facing massed together parade formations of B-1 battle droids. It's the only reason why you would have something like this. A droid army really stands no chance against this type of firepower. And let me tell you something, turbo lasers were relatively cheap to operate. They're not firing missiles. You just need some, very volatile gas to turn into plasma. And when these bombardments are finished, they can then deploy the Legion of Stormtroopers on board along with their prefabricated bases and walkers and all of their other ground personnel. So yeah, this whole ISD thing is designed to clear out areas with heavy and very hostile fire and then occupy. Oh, and did I mention that the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, the premier battleship of the Imperial Navy, has as many NK-7 ion cannon emplacements as turbo lasers. 60. Now this is crazy. I mean, no starship has 60 ion cannons. At most, you have 1 or 2. Even a ship as large as the ISD shouldn't have more than 10 of these things. But there you have it. The ISD has 60 ion cannons. And ion cannons are great at interrupting and destroying the electrical systems on a vehicle. That means shields, weapons, engines, and in the case of a droid-powered fleet, all of the computer brains controlling everything. The ISD might not have much in terms of point defense weapons, but can you imagine what 60 bolts of ion cannon fire looks like when it's heading towards a swarm of droid fighters? That'll do a lot of damage. And speaking of those droid fighters, commonly used by the Separatist Navy, let's not forget that at the Battle of Coruscant, the Tri-Droid fighter, along with the Vulture droid and Buzz droids, did so much damage to the Republic Navy that it fundamentally changed the future of starfighter doctrine in the galaxy, from featuring a more diverse and balanced field of different types of starfighters for different types of roles, including larger multiple crew member fighters like the ARC-170. But watching a tiny, cheaply manufactured automated drone essentially wipe out a very expensive fighter with 3 living souls on it is painful. No one wants to see that. And that experience pretty much shifted the starfighter industry to focus solely on fighting these tiny super agile droid fighters, which is why the Empire develops the TIE fighter around the twin ion engine design. These were extremely agile and cheap to build starfighters that were at least as disposable as a Vulture droid. Sure, it takes time and money to train Imperial pilots, but the way Palpatine saw it, he had trillions of unemployed individuals he needed to employ. Otherwise, they would just rebel against his empire. So having those people in that position was fine, and they were disposable for him. And so when you see those TIE fighters swarming out of the shield gate towards the Profundity during the Battle of Scarif, it reminds me a lot of those droid fighters swarming those ARC-170s during the Battle of Coruscant. It's clear in this case that the Empire didn't just try to learn from these automated droid platforms. They try to copy them as much as possible and mimic their performance profiles. The more you take a look at the Imperial Military, the more you'll see efforts to prepare against a droid-using enemy. Take the all-terrain armored transport, a replacement for the all-terrain tactical enforcer. The AT-AT is several meters taller than the AT-TE and has much more robust armor. The AT-TE was a relatively easy to take out target for an infantry fighting vehicle. The AT-AT, on the other hand, has no peers on the battlefield. Its incredible height made it impervious to landmines, a huge problem during the Clone Wars, where you had a lot of set-piece battles and prepared battlefields to fight through. And the AT-AT is ridiculously powerful and able to withstand most small arms fire and even some heavier vehicle-mounted weapons. It also provides commanders with a great vantage point to inspect an enemy army, especially a large droid army. So yeah, as you see, when preparing for the next war, military forces oftentimes look towards the last war for inspiration. And before we criticize the Empire too much for getting this wrong, most military forces get this wrong. A peacetime military transitioning to a wartime military is a very volatile thing. You'll see that oftentimes they'll change major doctrine just to adapt to the latest thing that's happening on the battlefield. Like, you look at the conflict in Ukraine with all these freaking drones everywhere. It's a new type of war fighting that we've probably will have to get used to now. And this has always happened in conflicts. It wasn't uncommon during the first few months of World War I to see cavalry units being deployed mostly for reconnaissance, but that pretty much died out once it became clear that World War I would be a much more static affair, especially on the Western Front. Of course, that's also what the French thought World War II would be, but instead of having large-scale trench warfare, we witnessed the birth of modern maneuver warfare. And so yeah, trying to predict the future is a tough thing. It's something that military forces always get wrong, and even if they get it right, the attacking force, their enemy, can always then shift their preparations to counter you, which is exactly what happened with the Empire and the Rebellion, right? The rebels had plenty of time to kind of wait quietly in the shadows and develop the perfect counter towards the ISD and the TIE fighter. And so yeah, as far as the Empire was concerned, the biggest threat that they could foresee in their future would take shape in the form of a massive droid army. And that is why the Imperial military looks the way it does. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. See you next time.